2016 Democratic National Convention. My name is Mickey Simon, and I'm the immediate past chair of the board of the AJC Philadelphia Southern New Jersey Regional Office. I'd like to say that without the great hard work of our regional office staff here in Philadelphia, we could not pull off all of the programming for the 4 days of this convention, starting with this morning. And welcome to Philadelphia. I won't list all of the great things about Philadelphia that I'm sure you'll hear over and over and over during the next 4 days. It's also my privilege not only to offer greetings this morning on behalf of AJC, but also to host you at my law firm here, Montgomery, McCracken, Walker, and Rhodes. AJC, as many of you already know, is the leading global Jewish advocacy organization with unparalleled access to diplomats, government officials, and religious leaders around the world, many of whom you'll see at AJC programs over the course of the next 4 days. AJC has been aptly described as the State Department of the Jewish people, which speaks to the organization's access to and relationships with government officials, diplomats, and religious leaders around the world. Through these contacts and our deep understanding of key issues, AJC works to impact opinion and policy at the highest levels. For those of you at our AJC event for the first time, I hope that today will whet your appetite for what AJC can do and what might be of interest to you. AJC is a truly global organization with 22 regional offices across the United States, 10 overseas posts, including Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and very soon our newest office in Warsaw, and with formal partnerships with more than 30 international Jewish communities around the entire world. I hope you'll consider the AJC Philadelphia Southern New Jersey region your local portal to AJC's global network. This week, AJC will host programs centered on many of the agency's core priorities. Perhaps you'll recognize it if I say something very unconventional and call them AJC's 4 questions. These being anti-Semitism at home and abroad, the subject of this morning's panel discussion, the political implications of changing U.S. demographics, which is critical for our interfaith and intergroup outreach efforts, America's global leadership role, and finally, the challenges and opportunities in the Middle East that await the next U.S. administration, which will be here in this room on Thursday morning. Last week, the AJC was in Cleveland for an identical set of sessions at the Republican National Convention. Senators Bob Corker and Tom Cotton and the ambassadors of Israel, the European Union, and India to the United States were just some of the many diplomats, elected officials, and senior analysts who joined AJC at the RNC. And we have another great lineup here today at the DNC, which you'll see on ABC and NBC and whatever. It's important to note that AJC is a 501c3 organization, which means that we neither endorse nor oppose candidates for office. Still, as an advocacy organization, we cherish the relationships we've cultivated on both sides of the aisle, and our program during these conventions is a wonderful opportunity to celebrate and advance those relationships. Before I turn things over to our distinguished panelists and moderator, I want to welcome a very special guest. 1 year ago, AJC's regional offices undertook an ambitious challenge called Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism. We crafted a pledge and spread the word to mayors across the United States, asking them to sign their name to this denunciation of anti-Semitism and vow to combat this age-old scourge in their own communities. More than 300 American and European mayors joined AJC's Mayors United campaign. I believe at your seats you have of the list. In Philadelphia, our former Mayor Nadler and our current Mayor Kenny signed the pledge. And when the mayor of Frankfurt was in Philadelphia to celebrate the beginning of a sister city relationship with Philadelphia, we introduced him to the concept of the pledge. And I'm happy to report that through the brilliant and diligent work of Deidre Berger, the head of our Berlin office, he signed the Frankfurt Pledge with the most fanfare of any presentation in Europe. During AJC's Global Forum in June, all of their names actually appeared in the list on your chair, which was a two-page centerfold spread in the Wall Street Journal. The names on that list range from London's Sadiq Khan, who I might add signed the pledge as his first official duty after having been elected the Muslim mayor of London, and said he was most proud to be able to take that action as his first official act. And including other mayors, including New York's Bill de Blasio, the mayor of our largest city in this country. The story of Mayors United, however, began not in Philadelphia, but in Massachusetts. That's the way things sometimes have happened for hundreds of years. But in any event, when AJC New England conceptualized the project and teamed up with Newton Mayor Seti Warren to get the ball rolling, we're delighted to have Seti Warren with us today. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome. Seti.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a real honor to be with you this morning. As I was listening to the chairman, I was thinking about how this initiative started a little over a year and a half ago. I was at a consulate event for the UK in Boston with my friend Rob Lycan, who's the director of AJC Boston. And as we were standing in that room together, we were talking about the challenges that cities face across the world. One of those challenges being discrimination and anti-Semitism. And I thought, what greater impact could be made in our cities? You think about mayors around the world, we have taken leadership positions on the issue of climate change. We've taken a leadership position around the issue of infrastructure and education. We've been innovative. The reason for that is we're closest to those who elected us. Mayors have a huge impact about what goes on in our cities from a policy perspective and setting the tone. And I thought to myself with Rob, what greater impact, what message could be sent than if mayors were to send a direct and clear message that we stand against one of the greatest challenges, insidious scourges of our time, anti-Semitism. If we band together and we get mayors in and around the country, our own country, and mayors around the world to sign a pledge that we do everything we can to push back against anti-Semitism, what a message that would send in our cities across the world. And from there, Rob Lycan went back to AJC, and this initiative started. Never in my wildest dreams would I think that 351 cities across the country, representing over 86 million people, would sign on to this pledge in a year, and over 190 cities in Europe, mayors in Europe, would sign on to this pledge, representing 70 million people. I would never imagine that we'd be standing here today celebrating that. I am so pleased and happy that we made the effort and that we've accomplished what we've accomplished. But we know we have more work to do. We know we have more work to do. In my own city of Newton, Massachusetts, is a city of 88,000 people. 30% of our population is Jewish. In Massachusetts, it was reported recently by a noted organization, there's a rise in anti-Semitism. And I saw recently in my own city of Newton a rise of anti-Semitism and incidents in our schools and elsewhere. We worked in the last 6 months to push back against that with deliberate action, not only with our police department, but engagement at the school level and the community level. We have to continue to work. If we are not working, we will fall behind on this issue. So I'm so proud that we've made this much progress in almost less than a year, more work to do. Finally, this fall, for the first time, mayors are gathering around the world. There's something called the Global Parliament of Mayors that is getting together in September. It is my intention, working with AJC, to not only commemorate the work that we've done in Europe together with U.S. mayors and European mayors, but continue to get the effort to have other mayors sign on in September. So I look forward to the continued progress and work that we have in front of us, and I thank this incredible organization, AJC, for working with mayors and myself to push back against anti-Semitism. Thank you so much. I'm going to call you back up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, Mayor Warren. It's just probably the first Warren who's going to be a key person in the next 4 days, but not vice president candidate. And now I would like to end my role here at the podium by turning the mic over to Julie Rayman of the AJC National Staff, also without whose help we would never been able to put together these programs for 4 days this week, and turn it over to her so she can introduce the outstanding panel today and moderate the discussion. Julie?
Thank you, Mickey, and thank you so much, Mayor Warren. That was really an outstanding way of framing the discussion that we're about to have and kicking this off in a really meaningful way. It's my pleasure first to introduce our panelists, and unfortunately, Rabia Chowdhury was unable to come to Philadelphia this week due to a family emergency. So she's no longer with us, but our panel is large and fruitful, and I know the discussion is going to be significant. I'm going to start by introducing Congresswoman Nita Lowey of New York, a great friend to AJC. Congresswoman Lowey is a co-chair of the Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism in the House, something I know she'll be talking about more with us later. But perhaps even more significant in her congressional role, she's the ranking member of the very important and very powerful House Appropriations Committee. We're very glad to have her here with us today. To her left is Ambassador Norm Eisen, who is a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and also a former ambassador to the Czech Republic. To Ambassador Eisen's left is Ira Forman, who is the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the U.S. Department of State. And personally, I will say he was also my very first boss as an intern in college. So with that, I think we'll start by just going straight to the issue, because there's a lot to talk about and tremendous expertise here. So I want to sort of take us from where the mayor started us off. The problem that we're seeing with regards to anti-Semitism, it's not an American problem, it's really a global problem. But here we are sitting in Philadelphia, in the United States, and you are all Americans in your own right, but have either previously or currently representing the U.S. government in some way. And I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition. How do we, as Americans, and how do you, as government officials or representatives of the American government, influence the globe when it comes to this issue? Ira, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think that the first thing to say is I'm always very grateful that the United States took the action through congressional action in 2004 to legislate a permanent position, the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. It's part of the State Department bureaucracy that deals with human rights, democracy, those types of issues. So I think we have over this last 12 years, we've had a significant impact on pushing back against anti-Semitism. The one thing I would say is the U.S., with all of our resources, only has a small role. Without NGOs, and I will particularly point out Jewish NGOs, I know in my term in office, the help I've gotten from AJC, from ADL, Simon Wiesenthal, a number of other Jewish organizations, is really critical for our getting up to speed and understanding the problem. But NGOs, Jewish NGOs, are not sufficient. It's really critical that our European allies step up to the plate. Some of them have begun to do so. And Mayor Warren, your initiative of bringing other politicians, elected officials in Europe is really important. It's an important piece of that. But even governments alone can't do this. We need non-Jewish NGOs, and frankly, we need civil society to step up, particularly in Europe, if we're going to be able to not solve this problem, because we're not going to solve it, but control the problem and tamp it down. I will also say, in talking about the U.S. government, we tend to be State Department centric, but the role Congress plays is really critical. And Congressman Lowey, we've known each other many years, but I haven't had a chance really to say to you, the work you did on Hungary, the 4 co-chairs, signing that letter to Prime Minister Orban, was probably the biggest victory we've had in the last few years against anti-Semitism. I got to say, there was a lot of people involved, a lot of organizations. The 4 co-chairs, Democrats and Republicans, signing that letter probably is the most important thing that got Orban to back off. So there's got to be huge coalitions to deal with this issue.
Thank you. Congresswoman, do you want to talk about Hungary and the task force?
Actually,
frame that?
can you all hear, or should we bring that closer? First of all, I want to kick off where you left, talking about the coalition of groups that are, or maybe you started with that, and I'll start with it too, because it's so important that we work together. I see Jason right there. Does everyone know Jason?
I'll adjust this.
Okay. I have to mention, Jason, does everyone know you? Would you please raise your hand? I just want to start at the very beginning, and I appreciate your kind words, Ira, about the Congress. But frankly, not only as a member, Steve Lowey, you can raise your hand, my husband's here too, and I have been involved with the American Jewish Committee, ADL, so many groups. But AJC is extremely important and invaluable in all of our efforts, and I want to thank Jason. And can you hear me? Oh, it's off, no wonder. It was on.
To the video. It's the other one that's going to pick up your voice for everyone to hear.
This was working a minute ago.
This one's working, I think.
This one's working.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say that no matter what the issue, I reach out to David Harris on a regular basis because I consider him not only a dear friend, but one of the most invaluable partners we have when we're making critical decisions, whether it's the Israel-United States relationship, whether it's BDS, no matter what the issue is, AJC is right there on the ground. And in fact, because I am ranking member of the whole Appropriations Committee, but I kept the ranking membership of the Foreign Operations Committee, and wherever I travel for my government work, I always check in with AJC because I think it is so important that I meet with the Jewish community when I am traveling, because you really get a handle on what's happening there. And I remember reporting back to David my visit to Turkey, and that was quite a few years ago. And the Jewish community is certainly restless would be the understatement, concerned would be the understatement, but they have been concerned, and the committee continues to shrink. So number one, I want to thank AJC for putting this group together. Secondly, with regard to the Congress, it is so important, whether it's the Israel-United States relationship, whether it's BDS, whether it's anti-Semitism, that we keep all of these issues bipartisan, There are too many people out there that get on their bully pulpit and politicize this issue. And I just want to make it very clear, as I do on a regular basis, that that is dangerous. And that's why when I and a couple of my colleagues formed this caucus, we did it bipartisan. We made sure we had, as close as we could, an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, because if we are going to be effective, we cannot make this a political issue. And there are too many politicians out there who do. I'll give you details in private. I won't say it as part of my presentation. So if you remember one thing, I just want to say that it's important that we keep this bipartisan. Now, two other stories that are related to this. I meet with many groups on a regular basis, and I was meeting with about 20 men and women, adults, two of which had been to the Hunter College rally. Some of you remember the UCLA rally. All across the country, there have been unfortunate anti-Israel, anti-Semitic rallies. One of the gentlemen was about 6'2", and he had a young woman with us. The night before was the rally at Hunter College. And according to the president, I'll tell you a little bit about it, because I called her immediately the next day and I said, what are you going to do about this? This 6'2" young man, whose parents came here actually from Turkey many years ago, said, we were afraid to speak up. The president insists there were people from outside the campus community that came to this rally. And frankly, too many people who attend these rallies really confuse them with anti-Semitism, BDS, the Israel-United States relationship. I happened to be there at the time because I was meeting with them, but to hear the stories they told were frightening. Tom Lantos's daughter then called me a week later about what was happening at Tufts. And Tufts has a large Jewish community. Others came to talk with us from UCLA, other colleges around the country. So it's important that we continue to strengthen these partnerships because AJC can't do everything. The college presidents need our community's support. And we are so focused, and I'm so pleased that we began this caucus. Two other points. We had the ambassador from Great Britain, the ambassador from Germany, the ambassador from France, who were very impressive, Ira. You probably work with them, talking with us, getting advice. There are no easy remedies here. And as you know, when it comes to the college campuses, there are dozens of college campuses where there have been incidents. Our passing resolutions help somewhat, but we have to do so much more, and we have to educate so much more. I can remember when I was in Budapest, meeting with the Jewish community probably 10 years ago, and I asked him, give me an idea of what's happening here in Budapest. No anti-Semitism here, but it's in everyone's heart. So we have a lot of work to do, and because this first question you want us to answer briefly, we're trying to be briefly as we can. I just want to say in conclusion to this portion, as a young woman who grew up in the Bronx, New York, and at the time there must have been, 80% of the school that was Jewish. I wasn't really sensitive to the anti-Semitism that exists in other places, but as the mayor expressed, whether it's in Congress, whether you're an elected official locally, nationally, whether you're a group like AJC, the challenge is huge, and we all have to face it head on and work together. And by the way, Jason, I discovered, because I got a call from a friend from LA, that there's an institution at the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights. Are you aware of that, Ira?
That's
No.
working on anti-Semitism.
No, they're not.
Oh.
So after one of these, of the many meetings I was part of, I called up the Office of Civil Rights, and I said, just in New York, are you aware of what happened at Hunter College? Are you aware of what's happening at Columbia, at universities around the country? And what she told me, they have 10,000 complaints in New York alone at the Office of Civil Rights. I said, you know what? If you're not aware of what's going on and you have 10,000 complaints, none having to do with anti-Semitism, maybe you better do some more outreach. So we are working together to address this, and we all know that this isn't a 1 week or 2 week or 1 year challenge. This is something that Ira's working on, Norm, many of us, with the guidance of AJC. So we have a lot of work to do, and thank you for coming today.
Julie's looking at me expectantly, so I guess it's my turn. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here, Julie, Mr. Chairman. You've done a superb job in your AJC tenure here in Philadelphia. And in addition to acknowledging the mayor, my friend Steve Lowey, Steve and I are often on the margins of events when Nita is speaking, and I cherish the opportunity to kibitz with him, but unfortunately, we'll kibitz afterwards, Steve. And Jason, of course, Jason Isaacson of the AJC, the head of the AJC DC office. I want to acknowledge Matt Nosenchuk, the able Jewish liaison from the White House, now at State, did a wonderful job through some very choppy times in managing the relationship between the White House and the Jewish community. And I always feel at home in Philadelphia because I am at home when my mother-in-law, Ann Kaplan from Chestnut Hill, welcomes me. I've got the best hotel accommodations of anyone visiting the convention. So I'll answer Julie's question about how we as individual representatives of the United States government can fight anti-Semitism by starting with Nita's point about the leader of the Hungarian Jewish community who said to her, "There's no anti-Semitism here." When I had the privilege, I'm going to speak to the but. When I had the privilege to go from my White House job, President Obama sent me to represent the United States as the U.S. ambassador in Prague, Czech Republic, at the beginning of 2011, with my wife, Ann's daughter, Lindsay, and our daughter, Tamar, the three of us. Every single thing that I did as ambassador was a rebuttal to the dormant anti-Semitism that exists, I'm sorry to tell you, like a virus hiding, and since then we've seen it erupt again and again across Europe. It's in the bloodstream of Europe, and everything I did was a rebuttal or perhaps an inoculation, and I will tell you why. The reason that the president chose me for this responsibility was because my mother was born in the former Czechoslovakia and was deported by the German occupiers to Auschwitz, survived Auschwitz, and so my coming back to Prague was a living rebuttal to the anti-Semites that they had not won. But it's even better than that, because the house where the U.S. ambassador lives in Prague, Czech Republic, fortunate enough to have my mother-in-law visit me. I know Nita has been there on Codels. We welcome many, many Codels when I was there. Wonderful. People don't realize these are not pleasure junkets. We work the men and women of Congress when they come to see us. They're fabulous advocates for the United States. This magnificent house where I lived was a house that had been built by a Jewish family who fled when the Nazis invaded the country, and the house where my wife and daughter and I lived was occupied by the German Wehrmacht as their headquarters in World War II. And I'm told by the historians that the deportation of the Czechoslovak Jews, including the deportation of my mother and her family, most of whom perished in Auschwitz, was briefed in the mass of the largest room in the house, which now serves as our dining room. And we went into that house, and this was a big press story, and this is why it was a blow against anti-Semitism, not just in Prague. It was a story all over Europe and even back here in the United States. We made the kitchen kosher. We put mezuzahs on all the doors, and we observed the Sabbath, lit the Sabbath candles in that former Wehrmacht headquarters every Shabbat.
Wow.
So every time I would eat a kosher lamb chop, I would say to myself, "Take that, Hitler." So I tell that story. It was big, big news when we did that in Europe, because there is such a tremendous problem, which we have seen since I got there. I hope it wasn't because I got there. We've seen an eruption of anti-Semitic hate, of violence, of the most odious language that has been used to target Jews in Europe for more than 1,000 years. All of the traditional tropes, even from leaders of major political parties, like Mr. Corbyn in Britain, which has seen a very lingering problem. We've seen right-wing, illiberal parties spring up and commandeer democracy, not only in Hungary, where Ira, Nita, and the Congress have been active. The Holocaust Museum, which I now serve on the board of, has also spoken out in Hungary. But just last week, a member of the Polish government engaged in an act of Holocaust denial, denying the Polish role in an infamous pogrom that occurred in Poland during the Holocaust. And we see these parties springing up. The Golden Dawn, overtly anti-Semitic in Greece. Jobbik, overtly anti-Semitic, calling for loyalty oaths for Jewish members of the government in Hungary. It's a problem all over Europe. And I was told, now to come to Nita's question, and then I'll pause and turn it back over to Julie. When I got there, I was told, oh, anti-Semitism, not a problem, no problem here. But within months, I had a neo-Nazi party that was marching on the embassy and had to double my security guard and my police protection because of a march I was participating in where the neo-Nazis were marching beside me and represented a threat. I will tell you, this is my last word, that what stimulated these anti-Semites to come out of the woodwork was the story that my being in this formerly Jewish, formerly Nazi, now American house, that story stimulated, it stirred up that latent hate. But the other thing that was really the stimulus was sticking up for minority rights. In my case, it was speaking out very vociferously for LGBT rights. And so I think this virus of difficulty with all difference, but particularly of anti-Semitic difficulty, is still very much alive and well in Europe. And I'm sorry to say that the events, I'll be nonpartisan because I know that's AJC's mission. But the political campaign has stirred up a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. And even while I'm sitting here today, I'm live tweeting the event, I've received some anti-Semitic tweets in my Twitter feed. So you really see it in the social media, hundreds and thousands of anti-Semitic tweeters, particularly for journalists for their coverage. So it's an issue in the United States as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that. when we were in Cleveland last week, we also found that if you see the very small camera set up over there, AJC is live streaming this conversation over Twitter via a media called Periscope. And while we were filming last week in Cleveland, we had a number of anti-Semitic comments posted, including one person who recounted that old joke about the difference between a Jew and a pizza and screaming in the oven. So there's definitely something to be said about, you can't hear me? Really? That's never happened to me before in my entire life. So there's definitely something happening, I think, in this society, here and abroad, where the extremes are given voice and feel like through social media or through other avenues, there's some sort of community in that extremism and in that hate. But on the flip side, speaking specifically about Europe, while you have parties like Golden Dawn and Jobbik, you also have the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. You have French Prime Minister Manuel Valls, these people who are willing to risk their political careers to speak out against anti-Semitism and to work to protect their Jewish communities. One of the things that Manuel Valls said after the attacks in Paris against the Jewish grocery store and also after the attacks against Charlie Hebdo was that we haven't seen enough outrage. We haven't shown enough outrage. And it strikes me that throughout this conversation, we've been talking about all these civil means of addressing this problem. What can the government do? What can civil society do? Do we need to show more outrage? And is that the solution, or is it just a furtherance of the problem? I'm happy to...
Let me give you a story. Many of you know in 2014, during the Gaza conflict, there were riots in Europe, there were attacks on Jewish institutions and individuals, and a lot of stories subsequently about Jewish aliyah from France to Israel. And I had the opportunity to go to Paris to talk to Jewish leadership in September, a month after the attacks. And we brought together at our Chargé's residence leaders from about 7 or 8 major Jewish organizations. And because of all that discussion, I said, what's going to happen to French Jewry? And the head of the Jewish security organization got up, a young man who said, everybody I know is thinking about leaving. Everybody. I don't have a conversation where this doesn't come up. But most of us won't. Just too hard to leave your family, your language, your culture, your country. Most of us won't, even if it gets worse. But that's not the end of it. First off, we won't be able to raise money as a community. Who wants to give money for a day school for a dying Jewish community? Secondly, and more importantly, many of us whose Judaism is not central to us, we'll just assimilate. We can do that very easily. He actually said most of our Muslims fellow citizens can't, but we can. Real easy. And why be Jewish if it means your kids in public school are getting harassed or even beat up? You send them to Jewish schools, they're the target of terrorists, as in Toulouse. 1/3 now of Jewish students in France go to Catholic schools. It's the safest alternative. And then he said, which I actually could verify, about Manuel Valls and President Hollande and the Interior Minister, our government's been magnificent. They've done everything we've asked and more, but we are very unclear if civil society, the society in France, will step up to the plate. And he said, ultimately, this is not about us. It's not about the Jewish community. This is not a Jewish problem. This is about the very values of the French Republic. We may be the first to suffer, but we won't be the last. That's the best way I can answer. And I think it holds a real truth. First off, one of the things we do well in the United States, and I don't follow anti-Semitism in one country, follow anti-Semitism in all countries in the world, but not the United States. We're the State Department. But I can tell you the one thing we do fairly well, we have very few hate speech laws. In Europe, you can get sent to jail for saying Jews to the gas. Most of the time you don't, but you can, because it's on the books. But we have a much stronger control. That is social pressure, because when you say something anti-Semitic in the United States, often, not always, you lose your credibility. You're a crank. You're not someone who is serious, because religious leaders, not just rabbis, but ministers and priests and even imams will speak out and call you out. Community leaders, heads of NGOs, business leaders, local politicians will call you out. Now, we don't do it perfectly, and I don't think for every group do we do it as effectively as we do with anti-Semitism, but that doesn't happen at all in Europe. And that's what this young man was talking about. Will civil society stand up for us? And speaking out, I think, is not a silver bullet, but it is a darn important piece of us pushing back against anti-Semitism. In many countries in Europe, leaders don't speak out. Merkel, the French leadership, Cameron in Great Britain have spoken out magnificently. A few others have, but in some countries, leaders don't speak out. That's just a first step. It needs more than government. So to try to answer that, I think one of the biggest things, and things we work on a lot right now, is trying to get civil society to step up to the plate. I do see Congressman Nadler
Yes.
just standing in here. Congressman, just
Welcome.
welcome. I tend not to want to recognize people in the audience because there's so many friends of mine who've come up to me and talked to me, but I do also want to mention Matt Nosenchuk, who Ambassador Eisen talked about. Matt works together with us on other issues other than just anti-Semitism, but tremendous asset to us of knowing the Jewish community. And we have a special office called Religion and Global Affairs that Secretary Kerry put together, and that many of us work together on a lot of these human rights issues.
Thank you. On the issue of outrage.
Yeah, Ira, I just wanted to follow up with what you said, because unfortunately, and I won't read all these, and I also want to welcome my good friend Jerry Nadler, who's an active member of our bipartisan task force. But when we were doing a little research on where these activities were occurring, Stanford University, Purchase College, Vanderbilt University, University of California, which I mentioned before, University of Chicago, George Washington University Residence Hall, UCLA was publicized. This is a huge problem. And in fact, I was so pleased, Jason, that in Westchester alone, I think you held 3 seminars where you had a couple of hundred students and their parents come to help prepare them, give them some information, help them feel confident in how they address these kinds of incidents. So what is happening in the United States is frankly incredibly disturbing to me, and I am frankly so grateful to AJC, ADL, and other organizations that can really feel this is, if not number one, but close to the top in their agenda, and you've been doing so much with it. Let me just mention another thing. When I was introduced before, it was mentioned that I was ranking member on Appropriations. One of my responsibilities is also ranking members on foreign operations. We spend billions of dollars to assist governments, non-for-profit, all kinds of groups around the world. And some of you may remember the SodaStream incident, where about over 900 Palestinians were put out of work when it was closed off. And I called in several of those groups. I won't even read the names here, very well-respected groups that were working and developed BDS policies, speaking out against Israel. And I said, I just want you to know, fair warning. because this is not part of your work, and you should be helping, and in fact, you should be pleased that Israeli company SodaStream should be hiring Palestinians who have lost their jobs. So I made it very clear, and I keep with my staff constant watch on who's doing what and what groups are behaving in which way with regard to BDS and other statements that frankly are so poisonous to the community.
I do think that there should be outrage on the part of everyone, number one. Number two, I think that it's important that non-Jews speak out against anti-Semitism, and that Jews speak out against other forms of hate. That's one of the things that I appreciate about working with AJC, is that you don't restrict yourself just to those issues. Going back to Twitter, Paul Krugman tweeted yesterday that when discrimination and hatred and bigotry emerges against minorities, anti-Semitism is not far behind. And I tweeted back at him immediately, no, anti-Semitism is always right there next to it. So that was certainly a theme of my ambassadorship. I think it gives us the moral standing as Jews to speak out against anti-Semitism when we criticize other manifestations of hatred. I know when my mother would painfully reminisce about her Holocaust experiences, she could not understand how the rest of the world turned their back on Europe's Jews, but she always felt, and she taught us, that we had an obligation to apply that same standard. Now, she never described it to me as a Kantian standard, but it is a Kantian standard of having a universalized principle that hate is wrong. In our Jewish tradition, sinat chinam, baseless hatred, is wrong, and so we need to speak out against everybody. Congressman Nadler, who just stepped in, was a leader on this in pushing back on this hate campaign against the Jews on Twitter. And the echo symbol, for those who aren't following this, the anti-Semites, the so-called alt-right, the tech-savvy new anti-Semites, were using the triple parentheses on either side of Twitter handles to indicate that this is a Jew who should be attacked on Twitter. And I received the triple parentheses. Many others did. The echo symbol. Congressman Nadler proudly stood up and voluntarily wrapped his name in the triple parentheses on Twitter in the echo symbol as a way of speaking out, not unlike the proud tradition of those going back hundreds and hundreds of years who stand with it's the foundation, part of the foundation of our country is to stand with those who are coming under attack for their beliefs or their origin. So those are the three elements that I think would go into the outrage against anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred, both by those in government, civil society, and just ordinary folks, Julie.
Thank you.
May I take the liberty, since some of you know I'm speaking today at 6:15, and my good friend Jerry Nadler has so much to offer. Since I have to leave, perhaps you can invite him to take my place. Would that be appropriate?
It would be unprecedented, and I think that you just did invite him. So, Congressman, if you'd like to join, you're more than welcome.
And I just want to thank you again for inviting me to be part of this wonderful forum, and to know that it's part of our convention. And I will say, Jerry, before you came in, even though some of us may want to talk about some nasty things that are being said out there, we are being bipartisan, nonpartisan, and we've kept our caucus bipartisan, nonpartisan, which at times is very difficult. So I just thought I would tell him that to make sure my good friend Jerry Nadler behaves. But thank you so much, and Mr. Mayor, it's great to see you.
Thank you so much. So, Congressman Nadler, not to put you on the spot, but I do want to give you the opportunity. We've just had a bit of a dialogue about the role of Americans and the role of American government officials or representatives of our government in dealing with a global problem. And then we had a bit of a conversation about, are we going about this the right way? Are we mad enough? Are we doing the right things? And what could we be doing? So if you want to take a moment to do that, or we can move on and you could go back to those topics. I am very cognizant of the fact that you are unprepared for this conversation.
Yes.
The other one will pick up your voice.
It would be unprecedented for me not to comment, so I suppose I have to. Who was it, August Bebel, who called anti-Semitism the socialism of fools? And it is, but I have often felt that that we enjoyed a 50 or so year hiatus in anti-Semitism. People thought that the aftermath of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, people had learned better, that anti-Semitism was no longer presentable. And I think what we are finding out is that that was not true, that what we had was a 50 or so year hiatus, which is coming to an end. And that so-called respectable people can now talk about anti-Semitism again. You see it certainly in some of the Eastern European countries from government figures. You see it in a different form, which not too many people have commented on. In Ukraine, they want to name cities, streets now, after Stepan Bandera and other mass murderers of Jews who may have been Ukrainian nationalists against the Russians, but were mass murderers. So the horror is wearing off. And maybe it's too much to expect a horror to be remembered and to be really effective for more than a couple of generations. I don't know. But the horror is wearing off, and we're seeing anti-Semitism again. And of course, what we're seeing now, you know, the Zionist, one of the rationales for Zionism was that Jews should be made a normal people. Theodor Herzl said that his task would be fulfilled when a Jewish prostitute was arrested by a Jewish policeman and came in front of a Jewish judge. Then we would be a normal people. Not that we want prostitutes, but that would be the normal condition. Everybody has them, and you have cops and judges and so forth. And Jews were stateless people in all kinds of different countries, regarded in most of those countries as alien in one sense or another. You talk still today, you talk about Poles and Jews. Jews were in Poland for 1,000 years, but they weren't Poles, they were Jews. And when Israel was created as a nation state of the Jewish people, we'd have our own state, our own nationalism. If you chose to join it, you could be Americans or French or whatever. But if you wanted to be an Israeli, then Israel would be a normal nation, the Jews are normal people. That was the theory. And what we're finding is that Israel, Jews who were pariah people, Israel is now becoming a pariah state. And some people, and some countries and some people have ulterior motives for doing that, nationalist motives, etc. And some people just submitting to prejudice and so forth. But Israel is now becoming treated in many ways as individual Jews in anti-Semitic countries. And certainly you see this in the UN and you see it in other places. And it's something we obviously have to fight, and all civilized people should fight it. And one of the great disappointments is that too many civilized governments have not chosen to fight it. And you debate if something is anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli, or I'm sorry, anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic. But when you hold Israel to a standard that you hold nobody else to, when the BDS movement says we have to have economic warfare against Israel, which is in effect what a BDS movement is, boycott, sanctions, divestment, is economic warfare. We want you to do this, we don't want you to exist, or whatever it may be, and we're going to bring sanctions to bear, economic sanctions, which is economic warfare. We're going to wage economic warfare against Israel because of its terrible oppressions of the Palestinians, etc. Well, wait a minute, people ask. What about the oppressions of everybody else? The oppressions which are far, far worse than anything anybody alleges Israelis do to Palestinians, with their mass murders and all kinds of things. And you can name any country, and the BDS leadership says, well, we have to start somewhere. That's literally their answer. We have to start somewhere. Yes, it would be justified to have BDS against 2/3 of the countries of the world, but we have to start somewhere, so let's start with Israel. Well, that's holding Israel to a different standard, and it's obvious anti-Semitism. And we ought to label it as such. So it's a real problem. We have to stand up and fight it and label this anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism distinction as largely meaningless. Because a lot of the anti-Zionist rhetoric, or a lot of the rhetoric that is labeled anti-Zionist is in fact anti-Semitic or motivated that way, and a lot of the anti-Zionism is motivated by anti-Semitism. Not that Israel is a perfect state or doesn't follow obnoxious policies from time to time like most other states. It does, obviously. But nothing distinguishes it in such a way as it should be the target of the kind of condemnation that it is. When you see the UN devote, the Human Rights Council devote 2/3 of its resolutions, or 9/10 of its resolutions to condemn Israel, and never mind what Bashar al-Assad is doing in Syria, never mind the genocide in many other places, or etc., doesn't matter, then you know that something's very wrong. So we're going to have to continue fighting this, and in particular, the particular manifestation more than anything else now here is BDS, and that's before it. I don't know what else to say at the moment.
It's really a shame we didn't give you a chance to prepare. That was wonderful, thank you. I want to move on to audience questions, but I think that before I do, Ira has something that he wants to jump in and share.
Yeah, I want to follow up on Congressman Nadler and this treatment of Israel. There are many different forms of anti-Semitism still out there today. In Western Europe, which we probably focus on more than any place else, the predominant one is this type of anti-Semitism which uses Israel as a stand-in for anti-Semitism. Often, and it's usually connected with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and often parts of minority populations from North Africa or the Middle East. But it's not the only type. We have classical xenophobic right-wing anti-Semitism in France, as well as this. We also have a new type of left-wing anti-Semitism, sometimes associated with green movements or anti-colonial movements. In Eastern Europe, we don't have, by and large, this Israel-related anti-Semitism. We have the xenophobia. But it's part of the difficulty we find. But in addressing this type of anti-Semitism that's associated with Israel, we have taken an initiative, it's probably the priority that we have right now, to get European institutions, including nation states, multilateral institutions, security organizations, to adopt a working definition of anti-Semitism. Recently, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, with an H, adopted unanimously, 30-some countries, this working definition, which essentially is what the U.S. uses. We have a definition of anti-Semitism, which includes examples of what some people call the 3Ds by Natan Sharansky, that anti-Semitism can be characterized at times by double standards, treating Israel with double standards, delegitimizing Israel, saying Israel has no right to exist as a state, and demonizing Israel. Classic example, what the Israelis are doing to Palestinians is exactly what Nazis did to the Jews. One can criticize Israel, as Congressman Nadler said, and criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. One can criticize Israel for many things. But when you start getting to this territory, we've crossed the line. We are now working with our European allies, including Germany, the UK, France, Romania, who took the lead in the IRA efforts, as well as the State of Israel, to get this working definition adopted, as I said, in different countries. Right now we're working with the OSCE, which will be a little tougher nut to crack because, again, We need unanimity among 50-some countries. But we will continue to work with our colleagues to make this happen.
Let me just add one thing. It occurs to me, should have mentioned one thing. When UNESCO, United Nations, what is it? I forget what the E stands for. Social, economic, social, education, social, and something with the council. Labels the Temple Mount, the temple area, a Muslim religious site, which of course it is, but labels it as only a Muslim religious site. Seeks to divorce Judaism and Jewish history entirely. That's anti-Semitic too, by the UN. To take a site which is the heart of the Jewish religion, the focal point of it, and has been for 3,000 years, and say you have no connection with it, despite all the archaeological evidence, despite the fact that everybody knows it. It also, by the way, although I haven't seen much commentary, denies the essence of Christianity. Because if there was no Jewish temple, where did Jesus deal with the money changers and everything else? I mean, it's essential to the story of Christian origins, the Jewish temple. And yet the UN, 59-0 or something, says this is a Muslim religious site, never mind the Jews, and by implication, never mind the Christians. This is pretty bad, too.
So I'll just add very briefly that al-regel ahad, as we say, on one foot, the essence of what Ira is saying, to me at least, is not that Israel should be immune from criticism. Of course not. Anyone who has ever spent 5 minutes in Israel will know that the Israelis are among the most self-critical people on the face of the planet. And like any democratic nation, Israel's many of the political leaders who I know and admire welcome honest criticism and self-criticism and try to learn from it. But when you see a really gross double standard where a different standard is applied to Israel than everyone else, and it is married to code words and stereotypes that go back for centuries, those are the indicators that it's not normal criticism of an allied democratic nation, but that something else is going on. We see a lot of that in Europe. We're starting to see it here in the United States. As I told you, I'm live tweeting, have some good questions in my Twitter feed if we come to them. But I have also gotten a tweet from Americans for BDS questioning whether we have a right to use the term anti-Semitism because all Arabs are Semites and most Israelis are not. So this is not an abstract phenomenon. It's happening right here, and increasingly we are seeing a dormant anti-Semitism, not just that's dormant and flourishing in Europe, but also seeing manifestations here in the United States as well.
So I think we'll start with questions from the audience because they're here. But if we get to it, I think it would be great to go to the questions you're getting via Twitter. Jason, did you have a question?
If I may, just a question and a comment. First, thank you again. Our excellent panelists, including Congressman Lowey, you're all very good partners. I see we're proud to be your partners. Especially, Ira, I want to pick up on what you just said about the adoption of the working definition on anti-Semitism. And to ask each of you, because you interact with foreign governments in different ways, as a senior member of Congress, as an ambassador, and you are, what is the reaction on the other side when you make the case to European governments about the need to confront anti-Semitism? Are they listening to suggestions made by those in the United States? AJC last year convened a conference in Brussels in which we put together an 8-point action plan on combating anti-Semitism that we presented to European governments. But when you walk into the offices of government officials overseas, are you getting receptiveness? Are you saying, yes, we can learn from the United States on how to combat anti-Semitism?
So before we jump in, I'm going to, for the sake of our media, repeat the question. And it was about the potential adoption of the working definition on anti-Semitism. Specifically, what is the reaction for each of you when you go in and greet specifically European government officials about adopting this, the pros, the cons, and if they are in fact receptive?
Well, Jason, as we said before, there are certain governments that are extremely receptive, And I must say, there are things that we don't know the answers to, and I'm sure, how do we combat anti-Semitism? What type of educational best practices, for example? I'm not sure that we have more expertise than the French on some of this. There are some governments, as I noted, are totally our allies in adopting this working definition and are actively demarching other countries, etc., on this issue. I was not at the IRA conference, because that's covered by our Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues, Nick Dean, but from my reports, this was, again, had to be adopted unanimously, so everybody ended up voting for it. That's a good sign. Now, there were a couple countries that expressed some concerns about these examples. I can tell you at an OSCE meeting that that the Germans held at the German Foreign Ministry last month, July, I believe, yes, it was July, we had this discussion. The vast majority of countries supported the working definition. No one came out openly against it, but we have some work to do, because there were some comments that I know there were concerns. Is this really appropriate? But we have identified folks that we need to work on, and a bunch of us are working on it. So I think we all thought this would be difficult in multilateral organizations, that you need unanimity in Europe. Those aren't our only targets. For example, Austria just adopted the working definition. It's on a UK foreign ministry site, I believe. I think it's a foreign ministry site. The UK, one of the major security organizations, used it. Again, we're trying to get various folks. I think we're pleasantly surprised, but this is not going to be easy. This is going to take some persuasion. But when you have, this is going back to, again, August of 2014, when you had riots in Europe, and associated with those riots or those demonstrations, again, the demonstrations in and of themselves against Israel and Gaza, we may not agree with them always, but freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, etc. But when out of those demonstrations you have people throwing fire bombs at synagogues, and then when these folks are prosecuted, a judge saying this is not an anti-Semitic act, this is an anti-Israel act, something's wrong here. And that's some of the arguments and examples that we use.
Because we're running short on time, I think maybe we'll do a grand sweep of all the questions and then take them all en masse. Yes.
This has been very educating. I'm listening and I hear different examples of anti-Semitism. What's your one example? Is there a different example? Is it here in the U.S. in the third example? And what I wonder is whether we're not making a mistake in lumping them all under one category of anti-Semitism. Some, for example, might be political, some might be religious, some might be this fringe element of society. And as I hear, I have to ask myself whether the failure to deal with it effectively is because we lump them all under one category, and therefore we're not combating them effectively.
Great. Just to repeat before we go on to the next, that question was about the myriad forms of anti-Semitism and the geographic differences, and are we able to effectively combat anti-Semitism when we lump all of these different strains and different iterations into the same category of anti-Semitism? Yes.
I'm State Representative Patrice Aaron from Utah. I'm co-president of the National Association of Jewish Legislators. We have seen a number of pieces of legislation dealing with BDS. I would love to have any of your suggestions how we can better deal with these issues as they are sweeping our state legislatures.
Thank you. The question dealing with state legislations tackling anti-BDS legislation. Yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm Jerrold. It seems to me that the people in the delegitimization camp, at least in the human rights movement, they're pulling up from the playbook of portraying Israel as South Africa or Serbia from past battles. Is there a direct effort to sort of target the human rights community and say, that is not this?
Comparisons of Israel to other countries with bad human rights records or bad human rights histories, and are we targeting them, or is anyone targeting them? Great question. Yes, Mr. Reed.
Stuart Ain with the New York Jewish Week. Has the quest for Holocaust restitution, property and home, etc., has this added to anti-Semitism?
The impact of restitution efforts on anti-Semitism currently. Is that it? Okay. Take it away, panel.
Well, if I may, I'll take two of them quickly. There is an effort to think about legislative responses by a number of those in Washington who work in a nonpartisan way on policy issues. So I'm happy to, the short answer is yes, there's an effort to do model legislation and other responses, and I'm happy to share the details more at length. I do think that the problem the gentleman in the back raised about in apposite analogies to Israel policy is an important one. We call that, in short, the intersectionality problem. It is the flip side of the issue I described before of feeling obligated to speak out against all forms of bias and discrimination, not just anti-Semitism. And the flip side is to attempt to unfairly lump Israel in a category of regimes, discriminatory regimes where it doesn't belong. I think the best answer to it is for us as Jews to be front and center, not only in dealing with anti-Semitism, but also in a fair way to express sometimes I'm supportive of Israel, sometimes I'm critical of Israel, to support a two-state solution. That gives us legitimacy, as many in Israel, most in Israel, continue to do. But to speak out against, in this intersectional nature, to really build alliances against discrimination at home and abroad, so we have very vibrant partnerships to rebut that unfair insinuation.
I wanted to continue in that vein on intersectionality, which is an increasing problem, where people, especially on the left, are being told, you cannot participate in Black Lives Matters demonstrations, or you cannot participate in protests against this or that, unless you also support BDS or oppose Israeli persecution of the Palestinians. Is how can you be concerned with blacks here and not with Palestinians there? It's intersection. That's why it's called intersectionality. It's all one thing. And Jewish students, in particular, liberal Jewish students, who want to participate in some of these things on many campuses, are being told either you come along with vehement anti-Israel criticism of persecution of Palestinians, or you're not welcome in Black Lives Matters and some of these other liberal movements. And that's an increasing problem, especially on certain campuses. And we have to break it, because the fact of the matter is, number one, you can legitimately and logically think that police are shooting black people with little provocation. We ought to do something about that without necessarily agreeing that the Israelis are persecuting the Palestinians. There's no logical connection, but if you're sympathetic to one, you got to be sympathetic to the other, and that's alienating the Jewish students, especially on many campuses, from being able to participate in some of these things. And it's also leading to anti-Semitic criticisms on these campuses. The other thing I wanted to mention is the BDS legislation. This is controversial in certain liberal areas. The legislation, state legislation, federal legislation, is along the lines of you may not boycott. As a matter of public policy, we are against boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and we will penalize you in some way if you participate in a boycott. This is met, and that's the legislation of a lot of variations, but that's essentially the legislation. This is met in many cases by the cry of free speech. A boycott is free speech, and anti-boycott legislation is against the First Amendment or is against free speech. And you're seeing this increasingly in Congress and, I don't know, maybe some state legislatures. All I can say is my own opinion on this, which is that advocacy of a boycott is free speech. Advocacy of being anti-boycott is free speech. A boycott is economic, or divestment is economic warfare and is action. Action is not protected by the First Amendment. Speech is protected by the First Amendment. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute, or it is said, wait a minute. We participated, liberals in this country participated in boycotts against the grape owners to support the grape boycott back in the 80s, and participated in boycotts against South Africa because of apartheid. To which I think the proper answer is yes. As a matter of policy, we disapproved of apartheid, and therefore we were willing to wage economic warfare. But there's not a free speech issue. And if we're opposed to waging economic warfare against Israel on policy grounds, that's a policy question, it's not a free speech question. So if you supported boycotts of the grape growers, or you supported boycotts of South Africa, you're not being inconsistent if you oppose boycotts of Israel. Neither of them are free speech questions, they're policy questions. And you can certainly, on a matter of policy, say South Africa policy is terrible in the 1980s and we're going to do what we can to bring economic pressure against it. And you can say the same thing about Israel. You can say Israeli policy is terrible, as a matter of policy we want to wage economic warfare against it. Or you can say, as a matter of policy, we don't think their policy is so terrible, or we do think it's terrible, it's not worth the boycott. You can be against the boycott on policy grounds, as I think most of us are. But it's not a free speech issue. Now, if you pass legislation and say you may not advocate a boycott, that is a violation of the First Amendment. But you may not boycott, that's action, not speech. I don't think that's a violation of the First Amendment.
Congressman Nadler, that's a very interesting analysis. I really appreciate it. It's the most cogent description I've seen of that. It's very good. Let me just take two more questions. The two questions, I'm lumping all types of anti-Semitism together and Holocaust restitution. First, as I mentioned before, we're certainly in our office, we're very cognizant of the various different forms of anti-Semitism. And anybody who reads much of the literature on this, the literature is very much talks about the same thing. But of course, this has been true for at least the 2,300 years we know anti-Semitism existed, maybe longer. But we've always had multiple forms of anti-Semitism. Some of the technologies, such as social media, how we approach it, there are similarities, whatever the anti-Semitism is. By the same token, each type has certain different arguments, some differences. I think one of the things we do is we look at anti-Semitism country by country and frankly prioritize where we're most concerned about pressures on Jewish communities. So, as I said, in Hungary, which we have great concerns, not just because of Jobbik, but some other actually actions by, at times, this government, which at times has also been done positive things with its Jewish community. That anti-Semitism is xenophobic right-wing anti-Semitism. We are addressing it as such. When we go to a place like France or in Western Europe, we are aware of various types of anti-Semitism, all of which we try to address. But the anti-Semitism that's putting pressure on Jewish communities now, is an anti-Semitism that is characterized by violence by a very, very small percentage of the Muslim populations of citizens of that country. As one rabbi in Sarcelle, whose institutions were attacked by firebomb, said, the vast majority of my Arab neighbors, my Muslim neighbors, have no interest in hurting or in any way affecting me. They want to, like the rest of us, they want to put their kids through school, find work, etc. But that small minority, largely young people, that very, very tiny, is making us driving people from our country. So that we focus, frankly, more on that type of anti-Semitism in those countries. So I don't think most of us lump this all together. It is not an easy issue. And as I like to say, unfortunately, it is difficult enough that we are not going to solve this issue. Not in my lifetime, not in your lifetime, not in your great-great-grandchildren's lifetime. But if it's not solvable, it is controllable. It's like a faucet. We can't turn the faucet off. We can sure as heck turn it down. But you have to recognize the complexity as you're doing it. Second thing, restitution. I don't deal with restitution issues. I have heard people in Eastern Europe at times say that restitution, use rhetoric about restitution and the greed of Jews, etc. It's certainly part of the rhetoric. I think it's a symptom, it's not the cause. That rhetoric would come out in different ways without restitution issues. So I do see it, but again, I don't think it's causal in any way.
Before I thank our panelists, I want to remind those of you who are here that we're doing this all week. And tomorrow we'd be more than happy to welcome you at our panel on how the changing U.S. demographics are affecting politics today. A very, very special thank you to Ira Forman, Ambassador Eisen, and even more so perhaps to Congressman Jerry Nadler, who so ably stepped in to fill an empty seat. We're very glad you're here and appreciate your insights. Thanks to everyone who's come to join us, and enjoy Philly.